Hello, and welcome to the grand launch of Jonah K, the latest book by Dr. Bob Bell. I'm delighted to be here with Bob and Mike. I'll introduce them in a moment. But first I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the lands of that has been home to Indigenous people for 15,000 years. That's 600 generations. My family has been here for 2 generations. The Indigenous people have been here for 600 generations. Yeah. So we are very grateful to be here and to be able to work and live on the land of the Indigenous people. So we've got an exciting hour ahead of us. I do think we've got 2 really cool people you're going to have some time to talk to. The first one I'm going to introduce is Dr. Mike Anderson. Mike is a surgical oncologist. He's an expert in palliative medicine. He's the strategic lead for the Indigenous health program at UHN. We're going to talk about that more in a moment. He's also the senior research associate at, help me.
Wakabaness.
Wakabaness.
Yeah.
We practiced. I failed. Wakabaness Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health. He comes from Mohawk and European heritage, and a member of the Bear Clan. Thank you. And Bob Bell needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. As a Renaissance man.
Oh, that's nice.
As
Thank
everybody's work crush. He's a raconteur, a surgeon, former Deputy Minister of Health for Ontario, former CEO of UHN, and of course a best-selling author. So we're here to talk about Bob's latest, in my opinion, best book so far.
Thank you.
Jonah K.
Thank you. That means a lot, Deb.
Bob has agreed to, or has offered to donate all the proceeds from this book to the Indigenous Health Program at UHN. And so I'm going to start this conversation by asking Mike to explain what the Indigenous Health Program is and how this money can be helpful.
Thank you. So the Indigenous Health Program at UHN is really new. We started in the fall of 2020, so early days, but our mandate is to improve access to care and quality of care and ultimately health outcomes for Indigenous folks. And UHN serves a large and diverse Indigenous community, both the Indigenous parts of the Indigenous community in Toronto and frankly all across this province. So
the work you do is at UHN, but you're involved in many other Indigenous programs, and I know you're asked to give advice frequently.
Yeah, and I think, although I'm based and I work at UHN in this space, Indigenous folks want to get safe, high quality care no matter where they go. Mm-hmm. So we don't particularly draw boundaries. We partner and work with anyone who's advancing this space.
So every time you purchase a book, Jonah K, a portion of the proceeds will go to the work that Mike is doing. Can you give us an idea of where that money might go, how it will help?
Yeah, I think one thing our team has talked over is that what might be very fitting given the theme of the book and the nature of the book is to talk with, we've been talking with communities in the north about supporting them. So using this money to support them, particularly in the space of training and supporting local healthcare human resources. So there's a lot of things that we think we can actually increase the value beyond financial. UHN has the ability to train people, and so we'd really like this money to support some northern communities and then hopefully add the value added of skills and resources that UHN has.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Isn't that great?
That's working as a system.
Oh, working as a system. And, you know, I got to tell you, one of the things I'm delighted that you 2 are here today to do is simply to celebrate the fact that UHN has an Indigenous health program. You know, when I left UHN as CEO in 2014, that would have been beyond imagination. The need would have just not been recognized. And the fact that probably one of the largest populations of Indigenous people needing health care are here in Toronto. Is that fair, Mike?
That's very fair.
Yeah.
probably on the order of 90 to 100,000 Indigenous folks reside in the city. And then there's a transitory population of people who are in and out. So,
yeah.
Bob, I really want to say congratulations to you on this book.
Thank you.
I think it's an important book. I think we should all read this book. It's a fun read. We're going to talk about some kind of serious challenges that Bob opens up in this book, but the truth is it's a great read. It's fun.
Thank you.
And it's a page turner.
Yeah.
And I think it's really helpful as we all are walking maybe a bit clumsily through reconciliation. We're trying to learn, we're trying to understand.
Try not to make mistakes.
And this book really shows us the impact of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us don't really understand what that is.
Yeah.
And this book helps us understand what this is.
Terrific.
How trauma from residential school can go through many generations.
Yeah.
So I wonder, Bob, if we could start by, can you tell us about this book?
Yeah, I sure can. And maybe the right place to start is to tell you where it comes from for me.
Please.
Is that fair? And when I was first deputy minister working with you, Deb, in 2014, like all deputy ministers do, started to travel around the province trying to get a sense of who was providing health care. And I knew most of the people in the hospital sector. So I asked the leaders in each community to introduce me to the community health leaders, mental health, substance use people, folks in community health delivery. And the first place we went was to Ottawa. And the end of our day was at the Wabinos Center, which is a community health center for people from First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. It's the center of Indigenous health in Ottawa. And we were supposed to be there for an hour and a half, and we missed our flight. We were there for about 2.5 or 3 hours, and we locked up the place as we were leaving. And the wonderful executive director, Alison Fisher, who was the first person to lead the Wabinos Center, had developed a little area for discussion about residential schools and their impact, not on the people who went to residential schools, but subsequent generations of people who were affected by the trauma that Indigenous people had suffered. And I'm embarrassed to admit that at that time, I didn't know that there were residential schools in Ontario in the 1990s. When I was practicing, I didn't know that one of the most notorious residential schools in James Bay, St. Anne's residential schools, where staff were arrested and jailed for the abuse that students underwent there, was open in the 1970s when I was in medical school. I was embarrassed that I didn't know that, but I was also embarrassed that having practiced in Ontario, practiced healthcare as Mike has for 40 years, I didn't know anything about intergenerational trauma. I didn't know the fact that today's healthcare for people was impacted still today by those residential schools. So I started to read about it, I started to learn about it. I wanted to write this book as soon as I retired from the ministry, but to be honest, going back to your comment, I was afraid to.
Mm-hmm.
I first of all was afraid as a writer. I didn't think I had the experience to do it, but most importantly, I was afraid of making mistakes, and I was afraid that cultural appropriation would be something I'd be accused of. So it took me about 5 or 6 years to get the courage and to actually get together a learning circle of folks who would help me write this book.
So, you know, Bob, you were deputy minister before you learned. I was minister before I learned. I had the very same experience. I didn't know, there was so much I didn't know until I became minister and until I was able to travel and go to communities in the north, to visit community centers in the south, to learn. So how that shouldn't be, you don't have to be minister or deputy minister to learn, right? That shouldn't be the way it is. So how do we get more people understanding the reality, not of what happened, but also the impact it has on health today? I think, Mike, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I often start out with, Justice Murray Sinclair's line. He was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and one of his quotes is, "Education is what got us into this mess, and education is what will get us out."
Yeah.
And I think that these conversations happening, there's a point in time where they weren't happening. So this is a good thing that they're starting. I think we should all be a little bit kind to one another and realize that on a learning journey you trip up sometimes, and frankly that's often how you learn. So doing it with humility, but recognizing we do trip up. And I think the fear of even starting that journey is almost more problematic. So I think at some point you have to start that journey.
Yeah. Well, the courage for me came from the learning circle of people with lived experience from the James Bay community, who a good friend that I'd met in the Ontario Public Service introduced me to. And we started in the midst of COVID. We started Zoom calls every other Sunday night. They were booked for an hour. They'd usually go for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. And I was told that I was a total idiot and that I didn't understand anything that I was writing about for quite a while. Also, a wonderful editor from the Walrus, who helped me write this book as well as the other 3 books, Sam and Madwar, was on those calls with me. And we would sort of do postmortems afterward. First of all, is this okay? Like, we were discussing some pretty triggering events that had occurred in the lives of people one woman who'd been a resident of St. Anne's School and was so generous in talking about her experiences, and more importantly, the experiences on her family and subsequent generations in her family. But we were a little concerned that we were making people relive things. And I know Justice Sinclair's Truth and Reconciliation testimony for many people was very triggering, and a lot of attention was paid to that. So,
yeah.
So I have to just tell people who haven't read the book yet.
yes.
This is not a dark book. This is a bright book. This is a hopeful book.
Yes.
And although I still think about Lily.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Lily is the mother of Jonah K.
Yeah.
And she is sitting right with me, Bob.
Wow. Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about Lily a bit.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good place to start because, first of all, one of the people who is our best advisor, perhaps, or a significant advisor on our learning circle, told me, Bob, the one thing that has to happen is that Jonah has to win. He said, people have to understand about trauma, but they also have to understand the resilience in our communities and the fact that we're on the way back. The doctors, the lawyers, etc. But Lily is probably the most important part of this book because this is a book about intergenerational trauma. And maybe I could read a bit. Would that be okay,
please.
Deb?
That would be just great.
Super. So I'll bring you up to the point where in this chapter we have a flashback. We've introduced you to Jonah. Jonah is a remarkably successful Bay Street lawyer. And he has made a ton of money for his best friend, David Morton, out of the cannabis business. He has sold an asset in Canada to a big American company at what you'll learn is an overinflated price through a variety of circumstances that depend on his cousin network. And we talked about that earlier. He gets a bit of information from his cousin network about the cannabis trade. By the way, there's a lot of truth to that story in the past, but I won't bore you with that. But we learn about Jonah, who's a very successful lawyer at the top of his career. And then we take you on a flashback to the time when he's 5. And Jonah's mom, as Deb mentioned, is a survivor of what we call the James Bay Residential School, very significant stand-in for St. Anne's. And terrible things happened. This was probably one of the worst schools that were described in Truth and Reconciliation. And Lily, who was a lovely young girl, a lovely teenager, was assaulted in the school and never recovered from that experience. And gave birth to Jonah as a single mom. Jonah never knew who his dad was. In Jonah's life, very significant, important people are his Auntie Mary, who is Lily's sister, and her husband, Mary's sister, Samuel Sunderland, who I love. I mean, I can't help it. I just love Samuel, Uncle Samuel. They are trying to help Lily as a single mom, and Lily is just not making it. She's making worse and worse decisions. She gets involved with bad friends in the community. She starts interacting with people who are bringing drugs into the community of Port Muskeg, which is a small community, fewer than 2,000 people on the James Bay coast. And Jonah's walking home from school at the age of 5 to a converted construction trailer where he lives with his mom. And he walks up to his house on a cold day, wind blowing down from the pole, and the door's open, the home is cold, the fridge door is open. He walks into the bedroom, there's his mom lying on the bed, and he crawls up beside her and she feels cold. And of course there are pills scattered around her, and then tragically, Lily has died of an overdose. And Jonah thinks she's sleeping. He goes wandering out into the cold without a coat on. His neighbor sees Jonah walking out in the cold and calls him, brings him in, sends her husband into the house where he discovers Lily and calls the police, who arrive and recognize that tragically Lily's passed away, take Lily and Jonah to the local health center where the nurse confirms that Lily has passed, and then they go to find Jonah's aunt and uncle and bring them back to the health center. And so maybe I'll launch in at that point. Is that okay?
Yes.
This is triggering for you?
Yes, it is actually. It's just so sad.
Well, it is sad.
Yeah.
And this is the generation of trauma. This is called trauma, right? Jonah remembered the nurse, this is the nurse in the health center, taking his hand in hers. She seemed nice, but she looked sad and tired. Jonah didn't know that she'd only been in Port Muskeg for 10 months and was feeling drained and absolutely worn out from the experience. There were supposed to be 4 nurses in town looking after nearly 2,000 people. But since she had arrived, there had never been more than 2 nurses on duty at any time. She was exhausted from working 60-hour weeks and frequently facing impossible situations, like she was currently about to deal with. She was 31, but she felt like she'd aged 10 years in the 10 months she'd been here. It's Jonah, right? My name is Nurse Darlene. Darlene thought to herself, this boy is so beautiful. Looks like his mom, but innocent with those deep, deep eyes. Darlene had been horrified when she examined Lily's remains to see all her scars and wounds. What trauma that poor girl must have suffered. How terrible that abuse must have been to give up on this beautiful child. Jonah, I'm afraid I have very bad news for you. Your mommy came in here very, very sick, and I'm sorry. She was just too sick for us to help. Jonah was nodding. She's asleep, right? Is she going to wake up tonight, or do we need to stay here until she wakes up in the morning? He looked up at his auntie. Maybe I should stay home from school tomorrow to be with Mommy. The nurse and Mary looked at each other. Both were holding their breath, trying to hold in their tears. Mary heard Samuel sniffling. Then Samuel just leaned forward, lifting up the boy onto his lap and enveloped him in his arms. Jonah, you're going to come home and stay with me and Auntie for a while. Your mommy's very sick, and she's going to have to stay here. But me and Auntie are going to have some dinner, and you're going to stay at our place tonight. Jonah smiled at his uncle. This was good news. He was so cold and so hungry, and Auntie always had good food. But then he frowned. But what about Mommy? We can't just leave her here alone. I should stay with her. With that, both Darlene and Mary started quietly sobbing, and Jonah looked at them both with puzzle. What's wrong, Auntie? Neither the nurse nor Mary spoke through their tears. Samuel held Jonah close as the little boy sat in his lap. Oh, geez, Jonah, your mommy won't be coming home. Not tonight. She's going to stay right here, but we're going to go home and we're going to eat. Can I say goodnight to Mommy before we leave, Uncle? At that, Jonah was even more puzzled because his uncle started crying as he looked at the nurse, saying, I think it's probably best that Jonah says goodnight. Huh? What do you think, Darlene? Darlene rubbed the back of her hand over her eyes and shrugged her shoulders. Well, I don't know. I just don't know if you think that's right, but give me a minute. I'll call you back. She left to arrange Lily for her son to see for the last time. She called them in, and Lily was lying under covers up to her neck. Jonah looked at his aunt and uncle who were beside him. Why is she sleeping so much? She's always sleeping today. They didn't answer, and Jonah shrugged. He walked over to his mother, stood up on tiptoes to kiss her cheek. "Good night, Mummy. I'm going home to have dinner at Auntie's, and I'll see you in the morning, I guess." Jonah took his auntie's hand and turned to leave, looking up at Mary. "I guess we should go and let her sleep. It's just so cold in here, Auntie. Her cheek is freezing, and hospitals always smell so bad. I wouldn't be able to sleep in this bad smell." They walked back into the waiting room with Jonah's hands held by his aunt and uncle. Darlene watched them leave, leaning against the door frame between the exam room and the waiting rooms. Samuel paused at the external door to open the lock that Darlene had closed. Shall I just leave it open?" he asked, looking over his shoulder at the nurse, who nodded through her tears. And then the three of them headed out to Samuel's truck in the parking lot. But before the door swung shut, Darlene could hear Jonah's soft voice asking, "Auntie, Mummy's not coming home, is she?" So that's the generation of, along with other experiences that Lily had had.
That moment stays with Jonah
In different ways.
In different ways.
In different ways. He's very lucky. His Auntie Mary and his Uncle Samuel.
I want you to talk about Mary and Sam.
Well, Mary and Sam, so Sam is a leader in the community, Port Muskeg. It's a fictional community. He is a man who understands the connection, and Michael, I don't know, maybe you'd want to comment on this, the connection of him and his people to the land. This is tough real estate, folks. I mean, we've been to James Bay. It's tough. It's tough winters. It's not an easy place to live. And Samuel, going back 600 generations, as Deb mentioned, Samuel's family has learned to live on this land going back 600 generations. And he knows how important it is to teach Jonah about that. And he does that. He teaches Jonah about the importance of connecting to the land. But he also teaches Jonah about hockey. And hockey is how Jonah gets launched, as Richard Wagamisi has written about in Indian Horse, the importance of hockey in northern communities and the opportunity it provides for some extremely good players to launch. And Jonah manages to launch, and he launches on a scholarship to Toronto, where he goes to Royal Georgian College, a private school in the heart of the city, on a scholarship. And that's where the second aspect of his trauma comes from, because I think this is a theme in hockey, and it's a theme in Canada. When we send our children away, no matter how seemingly good the environment is, bad things can happen. And other bad things happen to Jonah that contribute to further trauma. But he also meets David Morton. And David Morton is his long-term, lifelong best friend. And the two of them create some significant opportunity together.
They do indeed.
They do indeed.
So I want to turn the conversation a bit to another big important theme in the book, and that is about women in medicine and the challenges they face, the misogyny they experience. I think throughout the book there are several examples where, in fact, where Jonah, our beloved hero, is so rude to a woman who is a doctor. When his uncle is hurt, and he's just very abusive to her and doesn't want a woman treating his uncle because he wants a good doctor.
That's right.
That was one example. Another really interesting example was when, well, I guess we haven't introduced Bryn Allard. Dr. Bryn Allard.
Yeah.
Who is a crackerjack surgeon.
Orthopedic surgeon, Deb. Don't forget that.
Surgeon. And she's in the operating room with a very badly injured patient on the table, and her resident treats her very disrespectfully. Very disrespectfully. And there are other examples through the book where the chair of medicine tells her what she should do is be grateful to have a husband. She should look for a husband who understands the demands of her job. And if the law is anyway.
Or as Bryn says, he gives me advice to get back together with my cheating boyfriend because he'll put up with my work schedule.
Yes. So there are a number of examples in the book where women surgeons are treated badly. Okay, so you're a white man.
Yeah.
How do you feel you can write those stories? How did you how did you find the voice?
Yeah.
The
Well,
permission?
That's kind of appropriation too, right?
It is.
Although I am an orthopedic surgeon, so that part was okay. Well, that was our second learning circle.
Yeah.
And I worried in the chapter called The Chair that you've described, where Bryn Allard, this spectacularly talented surgeon, who's not only a great surgeon, as we learned in a couple of episodes where we tell you about what's going on in operating rooms, she's a brilliant researcher, and she's just won the award in the University of Toronto for surgical teaching. So this is a triple threat.
And she's gorgeous.
Well,
But
naturally. This is a
gorgeous.
novel. You gotta write novels
but
about
she's
good
got it
look.
all going.
She's got it going for her. She
Yeah.
does indeed. Auburn, wavy hair, etc. And she arrives for her annual performance assessment, and Michael and I know all about how trying those episodes can be. And it's horrible. She's been the best surgeon in Toronto, and all her surgical chair wants to talk about is her boyfriend, who she's had a bad experience with recently. And, I thought I might be overwriting this. I thought maybe I was taking this a step too far, although, you constantly hear from women surgeons, they get paid less, they get different referrals, that it's surgical misogyny is alive in Ontario today, is what you hear from many women surgeons. So I wanted to take this to a second learning surgeon, where I gathered together a group of surgeons, some of whom are orthopedic surgeons, and again, Zoom conferences where they would read chapters and give me their feedback. And I was thinking they'd say, "Oh, come on, Bob. It ain't that bad." And the conversation after 2 hours of the 1 hour book Zoom call would be, "You don't know how bad it is. And it's actually what you wrote is true." So, I think storytelling is a great way to talk about things that are happening, describe intergenerational trauma. And I heard a lot about facts of surgical misogyny, but I've also heard a lot of my surgical colleagues say, that's wokeism. Don't talk about wokeism. Women surgeons bill the same as we do. How can they possibly make less money? So I think this is an important topic, and it's great to be able to tell stories about it. And just like Jonah K had to win, eventually Bryn's going to win too.
So why did you choose that theme?
So, Mike has mentioned the importance of matrilineal leadership in Indigenous communities. I had the experience of trying to learn about how we could provide better health care to Indigenous people in this province, in this country. And one of the experiences I had was talking to people from Aboriginal health access centers. And it became very obvious these people had great ideas about performing better culturally appropriate care, great ways that we should be changing our system to respond to those people. And the thing that always struck me was they were always women, leaders. And Mike, you've talked about matrilineal leadership and mitochondrial DNA that goes along with that.
Yeah, I was privileged years ago to listen to a traditional healer talking about our societies are matrilineal. And don't you think it's interesting that mitochondrial DNA is always matrilineal? And one of the biggest disruptions in many of our communities is women being displaced from their traditional places of power, authority in community. I mean, that trickles through so many things. When you look at the parts of our community that suffer harm and violence, women are far represented. So seeing things that present women, and it's an important theme to see women return to a rightful place, to be treated with respect. I think there's some nice themes in this. As you said, it's not all about trauma, it's actually about strength. So I like the strength themes, and I think one of them that's important is having a female lead character who exemplifies strength.
Yeah. One of the things that I should give away as a bit of a spoiler alert is that, contrary to what you're all thinking, Jonah and Bryn do not hook up in this novel. Is that fair, Deb?
Bob, I don't think we should talk about this. I think people should read about this.
Okay, fair enough.
I think
Fair
this
enough.
is. I think we'll just let that one dangle.
Okay, terrific, terrific. But the one thing I did learn is that surgical misogyny, both this side of the American border and south of the border, is alive and well, and it's something that we should be talking about and recognizing, no question.
So you said surgical misogyny. Is it worse in the world of surgery?
So that's interesting. And you know, the University of Toronto just appointed its first woman chair of surgery. The most important position in Canadian surgery is now held by Dr. Carol Swallow, who is an incredibly talented surgeon. I used to operate with her. You know her from Mount Sinai, Mike, and that's a huge step forward. You know, as we talked about in other things are improving, but there's still an undercurrent. And the interesting thing is, in healthcare, you know, more women are graduating from medical school today than men. Mm-hmm. Majority of graduates. But if you look at surgery, there aren't as many women in surgical residency. The number's creeping up. Certainly many, many more in gynecology. But if we look at other surgical specialties, fewer and fewer. And there are some places like Mount Sinai that made an absolutely brilliant lead at recruiting, developing, mentoring women leaders. But that's not the case across the surgical community. And, you know, it's a bit of an anomaly in healthcare, the fact that not only are women underrepresented, but the experiences that I've heard would tend to steer them away. And you hear about surgical learners who've had that sexist experience applied to them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make surgery a very attractive career. So it makes me worried as a surgeon that if we're holding away at least half the class from applying to the specialty, how are we going to have the best people? We all know that surgeons are the best doctors, don't we? Mike and I would agree with that. So, you know, we need to have access to all the brains coming out of medical school,
yeah.
And that includes women.
Yeah.
It's interesting because that talks in a different realm to structural things. We often talk about structural racism, but that's the same thing. That sort of structural misogyny, it's baked into a lot of parts of the training and the system.
It sure is.
And I find they're always interesting. It's like structural racism. People can walk around and you don't see it until you see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the theme about misogyny in healthcare and certainly in surgery.
Yeah, and I think back now on my surgical career and some of the ways that women surgeons, some of the hurdles that they had to cross, and some of the stories that you heard. And I personally did not say, can't say that, that's wrong, you know. You think back on things and you recognize that we need to simply talk more about that, and that's part of the contribution that we hope Jonah K is making, and part of the reason why you should order your copy, or order 10 copies to put on your holiday gift list.
Absolutely. Yes, so Bob, this is your third book. What have you learned about the art of writing?
Oh my goodness gracious. Well, the first thing I learned is when I started, I wasn't very good. And today I hope I'm better. I'm so pleased because Deb, I know you're a discerning leader. Hearing your comments today, thank you. They mean a lot. They really do. I've also learned that if you're going to try and write, you need to find a good editor. And I think she's on this call. I'll just pay tribute to Samia Madwar, who has helped me to edit all three of these books. And Samia is a delightful person who is absolutely kind and never says anything bad except when she's reading my writing. At which point she's vicious and brutal and insistent that we go right back to the beginning and start again. And the chapter that we read a bit from, Losing Lily, which is clearly the most important chapter of Jonah K, we must have gone over that, I would think, 20 times, both with advice from the Learning Circle and with Samia's wonderful advice about how to build tension and how to build pathos and all the things that we wanted to build into that chapter for understanding are due to the wonderful skills that Samia Madwar has, and I can't pay enough tribute to Samia in terms of learning how to write.
I bet there's more.
Well, the other thing is stories, right? I mean, you have stories from your political career that would be spectacular to recount, and some of them you can't recount, I know, but the lives the three of us have lived, we have stories. And the first story I had came out in HIP. It was an easy one for me because it was a story of being an orthopedic researcher working in Boston. I'd done that, and I'd seen an experience where something was being claimed that wasn't quite right. And thinking about the interaction of big dollars and biotechnology, that was the story. Second book was the story of when I was in general practice. And you'll remember this story, Deb. I was looking after a family, hadn't met the husband. The mom was obviously suffering. And one day I met her husband, who came in with venereal disease and wanted me to treat him and her without telling her. And when I said, no, that's unethical, can't do that, turned out he was a bit of a gangster. And he turned into Tony Malto in New Dock and Maple Ridge. And of course, this book stems from the experience that you and I both had in trying to understand how to serve Indigenous people with better health care in the province and the country. And what exactly is this generational trauma? And some health systems have addressed this full on. The Nootka system in South Alaska, run by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, addresses trauma as just a general diagnosis that needs to be assessed in everybody coming through the door and achieve outcomes, not just in mental health, but in diabetes care, avoidance of amputations, a whole bunch of general health measures, not by offering better surgery or better drugs, but by dealing upfront with the issues of trauma. And trauma-informed care is not something I think that we've been taught, Mike. Is that fair?
No, and the interesting challenge today is lots of people can say trauma-informed care, but when you tease out, so what do you actually do differently? That's a tougher conversation.
Yeah.
So same thing, it's a journey. We're starting, we're recognizing it, we're talking about it. When you really push people to what are you doing differently, that's the next conversation.
Yeah. It's interesting, Deb, while writing this, we were talking, so you're going to read about this, hopefully 10 times over before you package up those 10 gifts and send them to your friends for the gift list that you're going to use Jonah K for this holiday season. You're going to learn about the fact that Bryn Allard, through a variety of circumstances, finds herself in James Bay, working in the hospital in the fictional town of Moose, trying to develop a surgical program that will actually respond to the fact that a lot of elders in communities, and I've heard this and I've talked to people about this, don't want to come south to have their hips and their knees replaced, for example, because the last time they left their community to go to get a government service, they were going to residential school. And that general memory keeps people accepting being crippled by arthritis. So Bryn is there to try and develop a surgical program on the James Bay coast. And the wonderful CEO of the hospital keeps on reminding her, Bryn, delighted that you're giving us surgical advice, but we have to go and talk to the people. We have to bring this. You can't design a surgical program for people who live here. Because remember, that's what Egerton Ryerson did when he designed the residential schools.
Yeah.
He didn't do that to hurt people. He did that because that was going to be better. So we have to have those conversations.
Bob, we have some questions that people have sent us.
Terrific.
I'm going to just put some of these questions to you, if you don't mind.
Wonderful.
The first one I think is an important one. We've talked a little bit, but maybe we could focus. How can we ensure greater representation of Indigenous people in healthcare careers? More Indigenous nurses, doctors, allied health professionals.
Well, I'm just so excited with what Michael told us at the beginning of this, that UHN, why are we doing this? And why is it important to me that UHN is involved? First of all, because I like to give money to UHN. They have a wonderful foundation. You know, when you give money to UHN's foundation, good things are going to happen in general. But the other thing is, UHN is the thought leader for Canadian healthcare. And UHN having an Indigenous health program. And what Michael told us at the start of this, I think before we went on, after we went on camera, was that you're going to try and bring UHN educational resources to bear on health human resource development.
Yeah. So one of the things that we started last year, there's lots of frameworks for how you go forward. And one of the challenges is lots of commissions, lots of studies, a lot less action. So we said we have roadmaps. And we chose to say every year we're going to pick one call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and make that our focal point. The problem with saying I'm going to follow the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is it's nebulous and you don't get anywhere. So last year we picked Call to Action 22, which was about Indigenous healing practices and ceremony and really focused on it. This year on National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, we announced that we're going to focus on Call to Action 23, which talks about training more Indigenous healthcare workers.
Okay.
That's great.
Second point is it talks about enabling communities to retain their healthcare workers. And a lot of that is not having people from outside the community be transient, itinerant healthcare workers, but support them to upskill people who live in the community. So this aligns really nicely with our focal point for the year.
Glad that we wrote the book this year.
Yes,
Your timing
yeah.
is impeccable.
Number 23.
Deb, if I could just pay a brief moment of tribute to Kevin Smith.
Yes.
Because Kevin Smith, and to you for your sponsorship of social medicine at the UHN Foundation Board.
Very exciting.
And this fits to me
Yeah.
in the social aspects of how we provide culturally appropriate, sensitive care in so many ways. How we provide care to people who are experiencing homelessness, how we think about people who are facing other challenges. And, so exciting, Michael, to think that UHN's educational resources, the Michener, could be allied to the need for training people in non-certified health tasks, professions, but call it what you will, in James Bay community. Because let's face it, until we see the business leaders, the doctors, the nurses, the lawyers coming out of communities, as Justice Sinclair says, the answer is always education. But the other answer is it's happening, right? I just read the other day, the biggest land developer now in Vancouver is a First Nations community who won a land claim, and they're now developing something like 30,000 homes. Where I drive to the place where I'm privileged to access Georgian Bay, I drive by Wolf Energy. And the lineups to get in Wolf Energy are huge, not just for the HST minus gasoline, but also for the experience that they provide there. So, the strength, as John Ralston Saul says, Indigenous communities are on a comeback.
Yeah, and without a doubt. And you look, I think you mentioned this earlier in the day when we were talking, Mike, the number of lawyers and doctors and MBAs and Indigenous people who are getting a great education.
If I can just mention, one of the things that Jonah's passionate about, and I won't tell you Jonah's second business in the book, you got to read, after he gets out of the cannabis trade, having taken a big American company to the barrel over the amount they invest in his company, he gets into a different line of business. And he talks about the first 100 years of Canadian civilization. It's something I didn't know. The first incorporated community in Ontario wasn't Kingston, it wasn't Niagara on the Lake of Toronto, it was Moose Factory in 1672. And the reason that people came to Canada didn't have anything to do with our farmlands, because let's face it, they're pretty rocky along the St. Lawrence where people started farming. It was because of beavers. And the economic value of Canada to Europeans derived from the Indigenous ability to trap beaver. We wouldn't be here otherwise. As well, those people who originally came here to trade for beaver couldn't have survived. They would have frozen to death, they would have suffered from scurvy. They were welcomed to Canada by the communities, in this case along James Bay. And Jonah says that first 100 years we were partners in a very difficult place to live. That obviously turned out badly for us. But
So I also have a question. I think we talked about we're all on this journey together, right? We're all trying to learn more. And someone has asked very directly, what other books, documentaries, films would you recommend for those who want to read more about Indigenous people and their relationship with the healthcare system? So I'm going to go first. I brought my copy of Richard Wagamese's book, Indian Horse.
yeah.
And if you haven't read Richard Wagamese, just read everything he wrote.
Yes.
He's a brilliant author. His book, Ragged Company, is a real favorite of mine. Indian Horse is another. He's brilliant. So that's my recommend. Can I turn to you? Have you got a...
Yeah, I might do the documentary first, then I'll come to the books. The documentary, my team's using it as a teaching tool a lot now. The Canadian Medical Association co-sponsored a film called The Unforgotten. It's about 35 minutes. It's a documentary from a year or two ago, 5 vignettes, about 5 or 6 minutes each, and it's really powerful.
Can you repeat the name of
The Unforgotten. It's free. You can reach it online. It's available. The Canadian Medical Association sponsored it. I think it's really powerful because it's one thing to connect to people's head. It's equally important to connect to their heart. And it connects to people emotively. It's powerful. So I think it's a really useful teaching tool. I think every Canadian should take the time to watch it.
Great advice. The Unforgotten.
The Unforgotten. Wow. In terms of books, so I have to admit, it's taken me a while in the last, I spent years in healthcare reading nonfiction almost exclusively, and you think that's how, but the truth is, most meaningful way of sharing information is a story.
Yes.
Yeah. And I've really come to appreciate that nonfiction actually often is as powerful at translating information to people. Sometimes that gets around the dryness of nonfiction. So, I mean, Five Little Indians is fantastic. Yep. Jesse Thistle's From the Ashes. If you want something a little more nonfiction, I think of Seven Fallen Feathers,
Tanya Talega. Yes.
I'm a research person too in parts of my life, and I really love Sean Wilson, Research is Ceremony. It's a bit of the handbook of Indigenous research. It's sort of beautiful because he writes in 2 different fonts, which are his 2 different voices. Sort of the academic scholar voice, and then the Indigenous voice.
That's great.
And I think it speaks to often the challenge if you exist in this space, which is sometimes those voices are at conflict with one another. So,
Thank you.
Okay.
Have we stolen all your
Well, you've stolen a lot of them, but I have to mention Lee Miracle.
Yeah.
Raven Song was just about anything she's written. And the other person who, chance to listen to him talk, reading essays, reading novels, Thompson Highway.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. He's a wonderful raconteur and absolute value, no question. And I love what you said, Michael. You can read the dry history. You can read the transcripts of hearings. You can get that factual base. But when you listen to a story, it grabs you here, not just...
And there's a lot of truth in stories, right?
There is.
It might not be facts, but it's stories, and
absolutely
the truth is there. Thank you. We're giving you some good advice here.
Yeah, you're getting good advice. Think about your gift list in return for this advice.
When we talk about the books, the gift list, I think we should have packages of 3 books. Have we got lots of the other books available?
What a great idea!
Do you think we could do
you definitely can do that right now online. You can definitely bring together
all 3. We'll throw in the ribbon that you can tie them.
Well, actually, you know what we will do for anybody that orders several books. I've tripped around Toronto the last couple of books signing, and I don't feel that comfortable being a potential super spreader, right? As we come into the fall season with RSV and with still COVID alive. A different way to do it, if you buy a bunch of books, just email me or email the foundation, tell them how many you've bought, and we'll send you out some wonderful adhesive plates that you can stick on the cover. And we're going to advertise that a bit over the next few weeks as an opportunity that you just tell us how many you've bought, and we'll We'll sign them, so they're author's signed. The author's signature raises the value of this book online from $21.27 to 28 cents.
Really?
1 penny. That's what the signature is worth,
listen,
apparently.
you start with the pennies and they turn into
Build
dollars.
from there. Yes, indeed.
So let me go back to the questions here. Somebody is asking, says this, I've tried to have discussions about these topics and have been met with resistance.
Mm-hmm.
How can I reach people like this and have these important conversations? Or do you let them just die away?
Boy, I think Michael has some great advice here.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to, I think a lot of things are rooted in people don't have a lot of education. I often remember you have to start gently. If you hit people in the face, they sort of do the human thing and they disconnect. So I tend to start gently with people. I think in this space as well, nonfiction novels are sometimes an easier way for people to get there. But I think it's about starting the conversations. I think there's more and more people who are open to it. And I got to be honest, I don't invest an enormous amount of effort in people who are abject, just no. They'll come along when the vast majority of people who don't know but are willing to learn come along. So I tend to invest my effort in that crowd.
Mike, I'm going to put you in a spot, and I apologize in advance for doing that. You were telling Bob and me a story before we went on air about an experience you had when people weren't aware of your heritage and were racist in front of you.
Yeah.
And maybe you can tell us a bit about what you did and what you wish you had done.
Yeah, I actually tell the story a lot because it probably tells you the impact it had on me. So when I was a medical student, final year of medical school, I was admitting a child, a First Nations child with his family who'd been flown in from a remote community. And as I was admitting the child who was sick, I was listening to the conversation that was happening between the pediatrician, the nurses, and they were talking about this family. And the parents, once they dropped this child off, they would be drunk for a week. We wouldn't see them. They would come and pick the child up when we discharged them. So they reinforced a bunch of stereotypes, alcohol, bad parents, and a whole bunch of things happened. One, as a learner, it told me, yep, this is a space you do not want to identify, that you do not want them to know you're Mohawk, because if they're judging this family who they've never met before, they're going to judge me. The second thing that was really apparent was if I could feel it and the nurses could see it, everyone could, this conversation was open, the family could feel it.
Yeah.
So the family already knows I'm being judged. I was pretty junior. I needed references. I needed people to you needed your mentors to like you in order for your career to advance. So I learned what a lot of young, certainly white passing Indigenous people do, which is hide. And
Wow.
Medicine is moving. It's slow, but it's moving. But that had a serious impact on how I viewed the first stretch of my medical career.
And of course, we know that terrible story in Quebec where an Indigenous woman
Died.
died.
Yeah,
And
she's
died,
drunk.
Died to racism.
Died from racism.
Yeah.
Isn't that? And that's 2022.
And that's
2021.
2022. Yeah. So,
Thanks for that, Mike. That's
thank you.
that's an important story to hear.
Bob, I'm going to I think we're getting close to the end, getting a 5-minute warning here.
Yeah.
So, what's book number 4 going to be about?
So glad you asked. For next Christmas holiday list book purchases. Well, first thing I want to tell you is for the first time I'm going to do a bit of a sequel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
and that Jonah K and Bryn Allard.
As you mentioned earlier, we kind of left some...
They are such cool people.
They're cool people.
And they are doing so much, and they've got so many stories to tell that you're going to get a chance to meet Jonah and Bryn again in the future.
I'm very happy to hear that.
And the second thing I'm going to say is I'm getting courageous. This book gave me a bit of courage. So I'm going to tiptoe into the differences that exist between cultural communities around Toronto.
Oh.
So the provisional title is Towns Above Toronto.
Very interesting.
And Deb, there'll be some hospitals being approved for,
Yes.
you can imagine.
Will there be any political involvement in those hospitals?
Well, we'll be very careful in describing what it is. And of course, one of my best friends is a libel lawyer. And I'm getting lots of advice from him as we start this off. But,
okay.
you know, the thing is, Toronto, isn't it an invigorating community? Don't you love living in Toronto? And aren't we surrounded by challenges, but challenges that we tend to face up to, like we're talking about today, and facing up to the incredible diversity that surrounds us. And the good that comes to that, but also some of the tension that comes in that is, I think, a great story for a novel.
I can't wait.
And Deb, before we get on to Towns Above Toronto, probably a good moment just to ask you to accept for the foundation this initial check to the UHN Foundation from thanks to all of you who've helped to promote and sell this book. Check to the foundation for the first 3 weeks of sales, and hopefully with lots of holiday lists, we're going to make this double.
And that's $11,000. And I know you're going to have to give this back, but because somebody owed to you. But I know this is the beginning of something very good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We
Well,
appreciate
wonderful.
it.
Even more important than the check is to say thank you to Michael and to Ashley, your colleagues in the Indigenous Health Program who are teaching us on a daily basis, and most important, teaching UHN, the most powerful healthcare organization, the thought leader of Canadian healthcare, how important it is to think about these issues. Thanks, Michael, for your leadership doing that.
Thank
you,
you.
Michael. Thank you, Bob.
Well, this was
Thank
fun.
you for joining us.
Thank
And
you so
don't
much.
wait. Order today.
Order today and think about your holiday gift lists. We will send you lots of book plates to apply. Thank you.
Thanks so much.